They called themselves the people of Hatti, a name that once commanded the winds across Anatolia, the high stone plateau of what is now modern Turkey. For centuries, their empire stood like a fortress between continents. Holding the balance between east and west, they were the Hittites, masters of bronze, of iron, and of secrets buried beneath mountain stone. But one night, they disappeared. No battle cry was heard, no warning written, no survivors to tell the story. An empire that had rivaled Egypt and Babylon simply faded into silence. Sit back, relax, and imagine a world where great walls of stone rise out of the mist, where kings who called themselves beloved of the storm god ruled by divine command, and where armies clad in bronze helmets and chariots of iron thundered across the plains of Anatolia. This was no ordinary kingdom. It was an empire carved out of mountains, guided by diplomacy as much as by the sword. Their cities, Hattusa, Alaka, Yuk, Carchemish, were alive with merchants, priests, scribes, and warriors. But what made them remarkable was not only their power, but their silence. Their records were hidden in clay tablets, thousands of them, written in a language that the world forgot for over 3,000 years. The Hittite story was not told by their descendants. It was rediscovered in the 20th century, when archaeologists unearthed their buried capital and unlocked a lost script. And yet, the more we uncovered, the deeper the mystery became. How could a civilization so advanced, so powerful, simply vanish overnight? Some suggest war, that invading sea peoples swept through like a storm. Others whisper of famine, earthquakes, or rebellion. But perhaps, as with so many ancient empires, their fall came from within, a slow decay masked by grandeur. As the fires burned across Anatolia, the great city of Hattusa turned to ash, and the storm god's people were gone. Only ruins remained, stones whispering of kings, gods, and a vanished world. Tonight we begin to uncover their story, a journey into the forgotten heart of the Bronze Age, where faith, war, and mystery collided. The question lingers in the air like smoke. What really happened to the Hittites? And why did history let them disappear? High in the rugged heart of central Anatolia, surrounded by cliffs and whispering pines, once stood Hattusa, the capital of an empire that would challenge the might of Egypt itself. The air there was thin, cold, and heavy with the scent of limestone dust and pine sap, a land carved by wind and fire long before men built their cities. But when the Hittites chose this place, they transformed it into something more, a fortress of gods and kings. Walls thicker than any city of its time encircled it, made of stone so massive that even modern engineers stare in disbelief. From the Lion Gate to the King's Gate, the city seemed less built than summoned, as if the stones themselves had risen from the earth to obey their rulers. Inside, courtyards echoed with the sound of bronze being hammered into weapons and the murmur of priests chanting to the storm god of Hatti, their divine protector. The Hittite kings believed their rule was not merely political, it was sacred. They were intermediaries between man and the divine, chosen to uphold cosmic order. Every law, every treaty, every battle was offered first to their gods. And their gods were many fierce, restless beings of storm, sun, and mountain. They did not live in distant heavens, but among the stones, rivers, and forests of Anatolia. Yet Hattusa was not just a city of faith. It was a city of knowledge. Its archives held over 30,000 clay tablets, laws, treaties, rituals, and letters written in cuneiform, preserving the hum of a lost world. Here, the first known peace treaty in human history was recorded, the Treaty of Kadesh, signed between Pharaoh Ramesses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Hattusa III, two powers that had bled each other dry finally, laid down their weapons in a fragile balance of respect. But power built on balance is fragile, and peace is never eternal. Beneath the city's grandeur, cracks were forming, whispers of unrest, shifting alliances, and unseen enemies moving across the western seas. Some said the gods had turned away, their temples silent, their offerings refused. Others claimed the kings had grown too proud, too human for the divine weight they carried. And so Hattusa waited, unaware that its days were numbered, that soon its mighty walls would be swallowed by flame and time. The wind still howls through its ruins today, carrying the same question across the Anatolian plain. How does a city so powerful vanish as if it were never there? Long before they became an empire, the Hittites were little more than scattered tribes, mountain people who wandered the rugged plateaus of Anatolia, their origins buried in the dim light of prehistory. Some scholars believe they were Indo-Europeans, arriving from the north and settling among the native Hattians, whose land they would one day rule. Others suggest they were always there, children of the central highlands who slowly forged an identity of their own. However they began, the Hittites rose in silence, not with sudden conquest, but through patience, resilience, and the slow absorption of those around them. Around 1700 BC, a man named Hattusa, one from Hattusa, gathered these fractured tribes under one rule. He was not a man of mercy, but of vision. From his mountain citadel, he waged wars that would shape the destiny of an empire. The Hittites, under his rule, learned the art of siege, the science of administration, and the value of loyalty bound by divine law. Hattusa's empire stretched far beyond what anyone thought possible for a people born in the hills. His armies crossed rivers, crushed rivals, and built cities of stone where none had stood before. Yet, his greatest legacy was not conquest, it was stability. He gave the Hittites a capital, a sense of identity, and the belief that their rule was eternal. After him came kings who expanded his work. Maseli I, who marched his armies across the Euphrates and did the unthinkable. He conquered Babylon. For a brief moment, the Hittites stood as the supreme power of the Near East, their banners fluttering over the ruins of the world's greatest city. But victory brought more than glory. It brought chaos. Maseli was murdered upon his return, and the empire plunged into darkness. The Hittites nearly destroyed themselves through civil war and betrayal. For a century, their power waned, their cities burned, their gods ignored. Yet somehow they survived. From the ashes, they rebuilt, stronger, more cunning, more united than before. Their second rise would be greater than their first, an age of kings and queens who understood that power alone was not enough. Control required diplomacy, faith, and the ability to weave fear and respect into one. And so the Hittites prepared themselves, unknowingly, for both their golden age and the mystery of their end. When the storms of chaos cleared, the Hittite world entered what historians call the New Kingdom, an age of might, diplomacy, and glory unlike anything their ancestors had seen. It began around 1400 BC, under the rule of kings who were both warriors and diplomats, men who carried the weight of empires on their shoulders and the favor of the gods in their hearts. Among them was Suppiluliuma, a name spoken with both awe and fear. He was not merely a king. He was an architect of power. Under his rule, the Hittite Empire expanded its borders across Anatolia, Syria, and into the lands once held by the Medes. His armies were swift, his chariots unstoppable, his ambition boundless. Yet he did not rule with brute force alone. Suppiluliuma was a master of negotiation, using treaties, marriages, and promises to hold the fractured lands together. One of the most haunting stories from his reign came from Egypt. When Pharaoh Tutankhamun died young, his widow, desperate and surrounded by enemies, wrote to Suppiluliuma, pleading for one of his sons to become her husband and king of Egypt. It was a moment of unprecedented diplomacy, a merging of two great powers through blood rather than war. Suppiluliuma agreed, sending his son, but the prince was murdered before he could reach Egypt. The message was clear. Even kings could be betrayed by fate. This tragedy ignited conflict between the Hittites and Egypt, setting the stage for decades of tension that would one day explode at Kadesh. But within Hatti, the empire flourished. The royal court of Hattusa grew more elaborate, its temples filled with offerings to the gods of storm, sun, and underworld. Queen Puduapa, the wife of King Hattusa III, became one of the most powerful women of the ancient world, a priestess, judge, and diplomat whose correspondence with Egyptian pharaohs still survives in clay. Together, the royal couple stabilized the empire through alliances and reforms, guiding their people through internal strife and external threats. Yet even in its height, shadows gathered at the edges. Enemies stirred in the west, vassals rebelled in the south, and the land itself began to tremble with drought and famine. The empire's strength was immense, but its foundation fragile, built on the faith that the gods would protect their chosen people. But what happens when the gods fall silent? The answer would come sooner than the Hittites ever imagined. The year was around 1274 BC. Two great powers of the ancient world stood on the edge of destiny. Egypt under the young pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire under the formidable King Muwatalli II. Between them lay the ancient city of Kadesh, perched on the banks of the Orontes River, a crossroads of trade, ambition, and empire. It was here that the fate of the Bronze Age would tremble beneath the rumble of chariot wheels. The Egyptians marched north through the sands, their banners glinting in the sun, their king confident that the Hittites were far away. But the Hittites were waiting, hidden beyond the hills, their spies feeding Ramesses false information. As the Egyptian army camped outside Kadesh, the trap was sprung. From behind the dunes, thousands of Hittite chariots thundered forward, 2 men per chariot, their horses gleaming with bronze fittings, their spears flashing like lightning. They struck with terrifying precision, smashing into the unprepared Egyptian ranks, scattering soldiers in chaos. For a moment, it seemed the gods themselves had turned against Ramesses. Yet in the storm of dust and screams, the pharaoh rallied his remaining men, forming his bodyguard into a circle of defiance. Ancient records, carved in stone, tell us that Ramesses fought like Montu, the god of war, cutting through his enemies with divine fury. But the truth is more complex. The Hittites, after their initial success, were weighed down by plunder and chaos. The Egyptians, fighting for survival, managed to hold the line. The battle ended not in victory, but in exhaustion, 2 mighty empires bleeding under the same sun, both claiming triumph while knowing the truth. Neither had won. In the aftermath, diplomacy replaced swords. Decades later, Ramesses II and Hattusa III would sign what is now considered the world's first recorded peace treaty, a fragile parchment of trust between ancient rivals. Yet beneath that civility, distrust lingered. The memory of Kadesh haunted both kingdoms, a reminder of how ambition can drive even the greatest powers into ruinous stalemate. For the Hittites, Kadesh marked both their zenith and the beginning of decline. Their chariots had once roared like thunder across empires, but now their strength began to wane, their borders stretched thin, and the shadow of an unseen collapse loomed just beyond the horizon. Far from the roar of battle, deep within the Anatolian highlands, the Hittite capital of Hattusa stood like a dream carved into stone. Encircled by mountains and forests, its great walls coiled over 6 kilometers, crowned by watchtowers and gates guarded by stone lions and sphinxes. Here, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of pine and smoke. The roads were paved with smooth limestone that gleamed beneath the sun. Travelers who approached the city described it as both majestic and forbidding, a place where the divine and mortal met beneath the gaze of the gods. Within those walls lay temples larger than palaces, their courtyards filled with incense and the sound of chanting priests. At the heart of Hattusa stood the great temple of the storm god and the sun goddess of Arina, two deities who together ruled over the fate of the empire. Their idols, crafted in gold and precious stones, were carried through the streets during festivals, followed by processions of musicians, dancers, and soldiers bearing offerings. The people of Hatti believed their gods lived among them, not distant, but present, walking through their sanctuaries in the wind and fire. But Hattusa was not merely a place of worship, it was a machine of empire. Beneath the temples, scribes toiled in dimly lit chambers, carving cuneiform into clay tablets that recorded treaties, laws, omens, and dreams. Thousands of these tablets would one day be found buried beneath the ruins, the voices of an empire frozen in clay. They spoke of kings and queens, of rituals and wars, of gods who demanded loyalty and offerings. They spoke of a world where every action, from planting a field to declaring war, required divine approval. Even the weather was a message from the heavens. When storms struck, it was the storm god's anger. When drought came, it was a divine test. And so, the priests of Hattusa watched the skies, read the entrails of animals, and whispered prayers into the wind, seeking to maintain the fragile balance between man and God. But as centuries passed, that balance began to slip. Records became fewer, prayers more desperate. Somewhere within those ancient tablets lies a silent warning that even a city built by the favor of gods can fall when those gods turn away. The rulers of Hatti were not merely kings. They were living symbols of the divine, walking bridges between heaven and earth. Tudaliya, whose name echoes faintly through the corridors of time, emerged from obscurity to claim the mantle of power, reshaping the kingdom into an empire that stretched across mountains and rivers. Some scholars argue he was the architect of Hatti's golden age. Others suggest his rise was marked by ruthless conquest and fragile alliances. In the courts of Hattusa, the king's presence was magnetic, almost overwhelming. His words could decree life or death. His gestures guided harvests, wars, and marriages alike. Citizens referred to him as my son, and he was seen as both father and judge, warrior and priest. These kings moved through their cities like shadows and fire, performing rituals that seemed to bend reality. Under Tudaliya, the Hittites allied with Kitsuatna and struck against Aleppo and Mitanni, their chariots carving paths of destruction and conquest. Yet even the strongest rulers faced moments of vulnerability. After Tudaliya's campaigns, Hattusa itself was sacked, its walls breached, its streets filled with chaos, a stark reminder that even the divine king could not shield his people from the tides of fate. It was Suppiluliuma I who would rebuild the empire's might, carving his dominion from Aleppo to Carchemish, placing his sons over distant lands like pawns on a celestial chessboard. With Babylon held by the Kassites and Mitanni reduced to vassalage, Suppiluliuma became one of the most formidable powers in the known world. Yet even he could not escape the invisible hand of disease. Tularemia swept through Hatti like a phantom army, claiming the lives of Suppiluliuma and his successor Arniwanda too, leaving the empire momentarily leaderless and vulnerable. Masili II inherited a world scarred by plague and war, yet his eyes turned west to Arzawa and beyond. In these campaigns, Hittite ingenuity became infamous. Sending infected rams to the Arzawans marked the first recorded use of biological warfare. And beyond Arzawa, across the waters to Milawanda, known today as Miletus, the Hittites encountered Ahiawa, a distant power some claim was Mycenaean Greece, a civilization both familiar and foreign, tied to Hatti by trade, conflict, and mystery. These kings were more than rulers. They were conductors of a vast, intricate symphony of politics, religion, and warfare. Their power as ephemeral as it was absolute. But as disease, rebellion, and foreign threats gathered, even the mightiest king could not hold back the shadows creeping toward the empire. How would the Hittites survive when the flames of war and pestilence burned their streets alike? Imagine the plains near the Orontes River, dust rising in thick clouds under the beating sun, the ground trembling as thousands of chariots and soldiers prepare for a clash that would echo through history. This was Kadesh, where two of the ancient world's greatest powers, Egypt under Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire, led by Muwatalli, two faced each other in a confrontation that would test the limits of strategy, courage, and fate itself. The Hittite chariots rolled like a living storm, their bronze fittings glinting, their drivers shouting commands, the air vibrating with anticipation. Ramesses, young and ambitious, moved his forces cautiously, aware that intelligence could be treacherous and that the desert could betray even the most disciplined army. Some historians suggest the Hittites had planned an ambush, exploiting every nuance of terrain, while others believe the Egyptians were aware too late of the threat. Arrows cut through the air, spears splintered shields, and the deafening roar of war echoed across the valley. Yet Kadesh was not just a battle of strength. It was a theater of psychological warfare. Ramesses' timely reinforcements turned the tide, preventing a total Hittite victory, while the Hittites forced the Egyptians to take refuge behind fortifications. Both sides claimed glory, yet neither could claim absolute supremacy. In the aftermath, the immense cost of the confrontation became clear. Thousands lay dead or wounded. Entire fields were trampled under hooves, and the smoke of fires hung over the city like a shroud. This confrontation revealed not just the prowess of armies, but the fragility of empires themselves, dependent on trade routes, alliances, and the unpredictable chaos of battle. Scholars debate whether Kadesh was a strategic victory for the Egyptians or merely a stalemate that delayed the inevitable decline of Hittite influence in Syria. Yet the story does not end on the battlefield. Diplomacy followed bloodshed, as Hattusili III and Ramesses II would later craft the earliest known peace treaty, a remarkable document binding to great civilizations in fragile mutual respect. Alliances were forged, marriages arranged, and boundaries defined. Yet behind the formalities lingered tension, a reminder that power could shift like sand beneath feet hardened by war. As we leave the dust and echoes of Kadesh, one cannot help but wonder how much of empire is built on triumph, and how much survives only by delicate negotiation and the ever-present threat of destruction. What shadows still lingered over Hatti, waiting for the moment to strike. Even the mightiest empires, however, are not impervious to forces unseen. And for the Hittites, this force came in the form of a silent, invisible predator, disease. During the reign of Suppiluliuma, a plague, some scholars believe it to have been tularemia, began to creep across Hittite lands, striking with a lethality that no army or strategy could repel. Cities that had once thrummed with the rhythm of trade and governance fell into eerie quiet, their streets emptied, the marketplace abandoned, the clang of metalwork replaced by the groans of the afflicted. It is said that even the king himself could not escape its reach. Suppiluliuma, I succumbed to the epidemic, followed swiftly by his successor. Arnuanda, too, the very foundation of Hittite power, built on conquest, alliances, and control of vital trade routes, began to tremble under the weight of an enemy that could not be seen or negotiated with. Some researchers argue that this epidemic weakened the Hittite military at precisely the moment when external threats were intensifying. Masili II, who took the throne after Arnuanda II, inherited a kingdom both vast and fragile, one where victory on the battlefield had to contend with mortality off it. In the west, Arzawa and other neighboring states sensed weakness, launching attacks that might never have been attempted under a healthy Hittite leadership. In a grim act of strategy, the Hittites reportedly sent infected rams to Arzawa, the earliest known example of biological warfare, turning nature itself into a weapon. The scale of devastation was profound. With population losses from both plague and war, food production faltered, the economy strained, and cities that once projected Hittite might began to show cracks in their walls and in their administration. And yet, even in the shadow of illness and mortality, Hittite kings continued to wield authority, enforce laws, and conduct rituals, projecting a divine aura meant to reassure subjects and allies alike. But for every decree and festival, the creeping spectre of death loomed larger, undermining what no army could defend, the resilience of a civilization. As we move from these hidden enemies of disease and decay to the more visible threat looming from the Mediterranean and the East, one cannot help but ask, can even the most disciplined and powerful empire withstand the convergence of war, plague, and misfortune? Or was the Hittite downfall simply the inevitable result of forces both human and beyond comprehension? The story is far from over, and the shadows over Hatti are only beginning to deepen. The year was around 1274 BC, and the stage was set along the banks of the Orontes River, where the fertile plains of northern Syria stretched under a scorching sun. Here, two of the greatest powers of the ancient Near East converged in what would become one of the most famous military confrontations in history, the Battle of Kadesh. On one side stood the Egyptians, led by the indomitable pharaoh Ramesses II, a ruler whose presence radiated authority, whose chariots thundered across the plains like living storms, and whose ambitions sought to expand Egyptian influence into lands long contested by rival kingdoms. On the other side, the Hittites, under the command of Muwatalli II, had amassed an army that was equally formidable, their chariots and infantry drawn from across a vast empire that stretched from the Anatolian highlands to the northern Levant. The Hittite army was a marvel of organization and discipline, trained to strike with precision, while their commanders were masters of strategy and the subtle art of psychological warfare. For weeks, both sides maneuvered across the region, scouting the terrain, gathering intelligence, and attempting to anticipate the other's moves. The air was heavy with tension, the sound of marching feet and the clatter of chariot wheels, mingling with the cries of scouts and messengers racing along the dust-choked roads. Then, as if guided by fate, the armies collided with devastating force. Accounts describe a battlefield shrouded in dust, the sun glinting off bronze and iron, the cries of men and horses blending with the clash of weapons. Yet, the outcome of Kadesh was far from simple. Both sides claimed victory, each inflating their triumph in official inscriptions, while concealing the staggering losses endured. Some historians suggest that the timely arrival of Egyptian reinforcements prevented the Hittites from turning the tide completely, while others argue that the Hittites inflicted enough damage to force Ramesses into a defensive posture. Regardless, the battle revealed the limits of raw military power, showing that even the mightiest empires could be stalled by strategy, terrain, and sheer chance. Kadesh also marked a turning point in diplomacy, as the memory of this clash lingered in negotiations and marriages between the two powers for decades to come. It was a confrontation that encapsulated the grandeur, the risk, and the fragility of empires at their peak, leaving both sides to ponder the true cost of ambition. And as the dust settled on the plains, the question remained: could either empire maintain dominance in a world where rivals and new threats were always lurking, waiting to strike? After the thunder of chariots had faded and the cries of battle were replaced by the uneasy silence of a scarred landscape, both Egypt and the Hittites found themselves facing a truth as old as war itself. Victories on the battlefield do not always secure peace or prosperity. By the 21st year of Ramesses II's reign, roughly 1258 BC, the exhausted powers of the Near East converged once more, not with swords drawn, but with inked treaties and formal declarations. The result was the historic Treaty of Kadesh, a document that would survive millennia as one of the earliest known written peace agreements in human history, a silent testament to the enduring desire for stability amid chaos. The treaty was not merely a piece of parchment. It was a complex network of alliances, mutual promises, and guarantees, forged from necessity and calculated restraint. Hattusa III, the Hittite king, negotiated terms with Ramesses II that established boundaries in southern Canaan, delineating lands once contested in blood, while also arranging a royal marriage to solidify bonds of trust, though whether the marriage itself brought genuine reconciliation or was more a symbol of political theatre remains unclear. Both sides pledged mutual aid against external threats, a recognition that empires could crumble not only from war, but from the rising power of other kingdoms such as Assyria, whose ambitions in the east threatened both Hatti and Egypt alike. The treaty's language is fascinating. It conveys respect, formality, and even a hint of cautious camaraderie, revealing how two civilizations, battered by conflict, turned to diplomacy as a tool for survival. Some researchers suggest that it may have been a way for the Hittites to secure their dwindling influence while managing internal dissent and the growing pressure from neighboring states, while others see it as an acknowledgement by Ramesses that military conquest alone could not sustain Egypt's reach into the Levant. For centuries, historians have debated the authenticity and efficacy of the treaty, as fragments and copies survive in both Hittite cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, hinting at the care with which these empires documented their agreements. Beyond politics, The treaty also offers a glimpse into the psychology of rulers at the time, their desire for legacy, for control, for a world that appeared ordered even as uncertainty gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. And yet, despite the apparent success of diplomacy, the fragile peace could not halt the tide of change. For new enemies, shifting climates, and internal fractures loomed just beyond the horizon. The Hittites and Egyptians had secured a pause, a fleeting moment of stability, but the world they sought to command was already beginning to unravel. The question remained: how long could empires truly hold the chaos at bay? As the echoes of diplomacy faded, the Hittite Empire faced a slow, relentless squeeze from all sides, and it was Tudela IV who attempted to steady a ship already listing dangerously, ascending to the throne amid internal unrest and external threats. He was the last ruler capable of projecting strength across Hatti's once vast territories, yet even he could not halt the creeping erosion of power. The Assyrians pressed in from the east, their armies led by the formidable Tukulti-Ninurta, whose campaigns would crush Hittite forces at the Battle of Nerea, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Tudela IV responded with a mix of military campaigns, fortifications, and strategic marriages, trying to secure allies and maintain influence, even extending his reach temporarily to Cyprus, only to see it fall to Assyrian control soon after. Inside Hattusa, the capital, the weight of administration and the constant need to suppress revolts strained the resources of the state. Soldiers, once the backbone of expansion, were now pulled between quelling rebellions and defending against external threats, their absence echoing in empty fields and diminished harvests. Records hint at Tudela IV's focus on monumental construction and religious observance, perhaps as much a political tool as a spiritual duty, designed to reinforce the king's divine aura and remind citizens that Hatti still lived under the protection of its storm gods. Yet, despite these efforts, cracks ran deep. Tribes like the Kaskians pressed from the north, and other groups, displaced or opportunistic, exploited the empire's vulnerability, chipping away at borders that once seemed unassailable. Some historians suggest that Tudela's reign was defined not by victories, but by management, by holding together fragments of a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. His correspondence and treaties reflect a ruler acutely aware of the shifting balance of power, negotiating with both neighbors and distant states, attempting to keep Hatti relevant in a world increasingly dominated by Assyria, Egypt, and new rising powers. The economy, reliant on agriculture, tribute, and controlled trade routes, struggled under the constant drain of warfare and population loss, while the king's efforts to maintain authority in distant provinces were met with mixed success. Despite his reputation as a strong king, Tudela IV's victories were fleeting, and his failures, though gradual, were inexorable. By the end of his reign, Hatti's borders had contracted, its influence waned, and the stage was set for the final acts of an empire that had once seemed invincible. As we move next into the final kings of Hatti, one cannot help but wonder, could any ruler truly resist the forces converging to extinguish this civilization? Or was the fall of the Hittites already written in the winds of change? The name Suppiluliuma marks the final chapter in the saga of the Hittite Empire, a ruler inheriting a kingdom already frayed at the edges, stretched thin by decades of warfare, plagues, and the relentless pressure of ambitious neighbors. Ascending the throne during an era of mounting crises, Suppiluliuma II faced a world that no longer bowed to Hatti's power. The Assyrians, now dominant in Mesopotamia and Syria, encroached steadily upon Hittite lands, while the Sea Peoples, enigmatic raiders from the Aegean, began their inexorable push down the Mediterranean coast, seizing key territories such as Cilicia and Cyprus, cutting off the trade routes that had once been Hatti's lifeline, even as Suppiluliuma mustered forces for defense. Records suggest he achieved some minor victories, including a notable naval engagement off the coast of Alasia, hinting at his persistence and strategic acumen. Yet these successes were fleeting against the backdrop of systemic decline. Hattusa, the once mighty capital with its monumental gates and temples, faced depopulation and internal unrest. Soldiers were in short supply, craftsmen and laborers diverted to desperate reconstruction, and the economy, dependent on agriculture and tribute, struggled under the weight of continual conflict. Scholars suggest the Suppiluliuma II's reign saw the final attempts at centralized administration, sending envoys, reinforcing fortresses, and negotiating alliances wherever possible, all in a world increasingly hostile to Hittite survival. Meanwhile, natural disasters, drought, and famine, hinted at in dendrochronological studies of the period, may have exacerbated the empire's vulnerabilities, reducing crop yields and weakening population centers already burdened by war. Some researchers speculate that Suppiluliuma's downfall was as much environmental as it was military, a convergence of factors that left the empire exposed to the combined assaults of external invaders and internal instability. By the time Hattusa was finally burned, around 1180 BC, the Hittite state was already a shadow of its former self, its territories seized by Assyrians, Phrygians, Kaskians, and other opportunistic groups. The death or disappearance of Suppiluliuma II left no strong successor to unify the remaining fragments, and what followed was a disintegration into smaller Syro-Hittite states, each clinging tenuously to the legacy of Hatti. These successor states would persist for centuries, yet the empire that had once wielded power from the Anatolian plateau to northern Syria, from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, vanished almost overnight from historical memory. As we shift next to examine the enigmatic collapse itself, one must ask, how could an empire so vast, so sophisticated, and so seemingly unassailable simply vanish, leaving only ruins, inscriptions, and whispers in the wind? The disappearance of the Hittite Empire remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. A civilization that thrived for centuries, only to vanish almost overnight, leaving behind scorched cities, abandoned temples, and shattered trade networks. Around 1180 BC, the culmination of multiple pressures converged to bring Hatti to its knees. Yet historians and archaeologists continue to debate which forces were truly decisive. Some point first to the relentless invasions of the Sea Peoples, a confederation of maritime raiders whose origins remain unclear. These were not merely armies of conquest. They were waves of destruction sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean, striking coastal cities, disrupting trade, and dismantling the fragile supply lines that Hatti relied upon. Cilicia and Cyprus fell under their control, severing access to vital resources and strategic ports. Others emphasize the growing power of Assyria, which had steadily expanded under rulers such as Tukulti-Ninetta I and Osirashii I, annexing territories previously under Hittite control and gradually encircling the heartland in Anatolia. This geopolitical pressure alone may have sapped the empire's ability to respond effectively to external threats. Compounding these human threats were environmental catastrophes, hinted at in the Treering data showing consecutive years of severe drought during the late 13th century BC. Crops failed, granaries ran low, and famine may have weakened cities from within, creating social unrest and making populations vulnerable to external raiders. Epidemics, such as tularemia that had already struck decades earlier, likely resurfaced, further decimating the population and undermining military recruitment. Internally, the Hittite system of governance, once a model of bureaucratic efficiency and legal sophistication, may have been stretched too thin. Rebellions, succession disputes, and localized uprisings would have drained the kingdom's manpower and resources, while the economic model, heavily reliant on agriculture, tribute, and booty from military campaigns, could not sustain the empire under relentless pressure. Even the once mighty capital, Hattusa, with its labyrinthine streets, fortified gates, and towering temples, was not immune. Archaeological evidence indicates it was burned and abandoned, a testament to the suddenness of the collapse. Some scholars suggest that the fall of Hatti was less a single cataclysm and more a perfect storm of military, environmental, and social pressures, each amplifying the other, until the empire could no longer hold together. And yet, in the ashes, new polities emerged, the so-called Syro-Hittite states, remnants of Hatti's culture and administration, clinging to memory and legacy even as the empire itself vanished from history. But the question lingers: how does an empire that once commanded armies, wealth, and diplomacy dissolve so completely that it almost disappears from memory, leaving only tantalizing fragments for us to decipher? To truly grasp the magnitude of the Hittite Empire, one must step into the ruined streets of Hattusa, the capital that once thrummed with activity, the echo of a civilization at its zenith. Imagine approaching the massive Sphinx Gate, flanked by stone lions, their paws worn smooth by centuries of traffic, their stony gaze frozen in eternal vigilance. Beyond the gates, the city sprawled across the rugged hills of central Anatolia, a carefully planned maze of temples, palaces, and administrative buildings, each carved with cuneiform inscriptions that recorded the pulse of Hittite governance, religion, and diplomacy. The streets themselves would have been crowded with merchants trading in grain, silver, and bronze, craftsmen hammering out intricate tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects, and priests moving in ceremonial procession, carrying the effigies of gods like Tarhunt, the storm god, whose bull symbol adorned temples and shrines alike. The city was a sensory tapestry, the metallic clang of artisans, the scent of incense wafting from sanctuaries, the earthy aroma of livestock penned within city limits, and the distant roar of the Anatolian hills echoing the movements of soldiers drilling for campaigns. Hattusa was more than a political centre-it, was a living organism, reliant on the careful orchestration of law, religion, and economy. The Pankas, the Hittite High Council, would convene here to adjudicate disputes, regulate succession, and ensure that the king's authority, imbued with a quasi-divine aura, was unchallenged. Markets buzzed with negotiation, while granaries towered with stored wheat, carefully accounted for by scribes using weights in shekels, minas, and talents, ensuring that food could be distributed even in times of crisis. The palaces themselves, adorned with frescoes and ivory carvings, hosted the royal family and their retinue, orchestrating diplomacy with distant powers such as Egypt, Assyria, and the city-states of the Levant. Yet, even in this vibrant heart of power, tension simmered. Internal factions, the constant threat of famine or disease, and the ever-present fear of invasion from neighbors or marauding sea peoples created an undercurrent of unease. As night fell, the temples would glow with torchlight, shadows dancing across reliefs depicting gods, kings, and mythical beasts, a reminder of the divine mandate and the fragility of human ambition. In this city, one could almost hear the whispers of history, the stories of triumph and despair, and yet, within a few generations, these streets would lie abandoned, the gates toppled, the granaries empty, leaving behind only the stones and inscriptions that now beckon us to uncover the lives of a civilization that disappeared almost overnight. And so, we move from the grandeur of Hattusa to the rituals and beliefs that gave the Hittites their extraordinary sense of order, meaning, and, ultimately, fragility. To understand the Hittite Empire, one cannot separate its people from the gods they worshipped. For their entire worldview, law, and even politics were entwined with divine oversight. The Hittites inherited a rich pantheon, a complex tapestry woven from indigenous Hattic deities, Hurrian influences, Mesopotamian echoes, and traces of Indo-European sky gods. At the pinnacle of this celestial hierarchy stood Tarhunt, the storm god, a figure both awe-inspiring and terrifying, his presence invoked before battles, harvests, or treaties. Envision a Hittite priest standing before a bronze bull effigy, the bull's polished surface catching the torchlight as incense coils drift upward, filling the temple with a sweet, choking smoke. Tarhunt, depicted astride twin mountains with a club in hand, symbolized conquest, justice, and the relentless power of nature. Yet, even the king, though seen as semi-divine, my son, was accountable to these deities, performing rituals to honor them, ensure fertility of fields, and maintain cosmic balance. Festivals were grand affairs, spectacles that fused religion and statecraft. In Peruli, the spring festival, effigies of a Yanka, the serpent defeated by the storm god, were paraded and ritually slain, a symbolic reenactment of order triumphing over chaos. In autumn, the Nuntariashas festival celebrated the harvest, blending feasts, offerings, and divine theatre, while the Kilam festival transformed the streets into a living pantheon, 30 idols marching alongside human devotees, drums and horns resonating through stone avenues. Some researchers suggest that Hittite rituals also served as psychological tools, reinforcing loyalty to the state while codifying societal norms, where law and religion overlapped seamlessly. Even war itself was sanctified. Before campaigns against Arzawa or Mitanni, priests would bless weapons, recite omens, and interpret the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificial animals, believing the god's favor could tip the balance between victory and annihilation. Yet, the gods were capricious. Natural disasters, famine, and disease, like the decades-long tularemia epidemic, were often interpreted as divine displeasure, shaking both rulers and citizens to their core. Every edict, every treaty, every military maneuver was shadowed by this omnipresent spiritual framework. And as the Hittite Empire expanded across Anatolia and into Syria, it absorbed local deities, integrating them into its pantheon, often reinterpreting old gods to legitimize political control. But despite this intricate divine machinery, even the most pious adherents could not shield the empire from the forces both natural and human that would eventually unravel its power. From the sacred to the pragmatic, the Hittites' relationship with the divine provides a window into a civilization both extraordinary and perilously fragile. leading us naturally into the codes of law that governed such a world, balancing human ambition against the mandates of the gods. Close your eyes and imagine the rolling Anatolian plains under a turbulent sky, clouds churning as if stirred by invisible hands, the wind carrying whispers of ancient rituals long lost to time. The Hittites, a people deeply entwined with the forces of nature and the divine, looked to these skies with awe and reverence. Their gods not distant abstractions, but active participants in the fate of their civilization. At the pinnacle of their pantheon stood Tarhunt, the storm god, whose fury could bring both destruction and renewal. Some scholars suggest that Tarhunt, sometimes equated with the Hurrian Teshub, was not just a deity of weather, but a symbol of kingship and cosmic authority, embodying the king's dual role as ruler and high priest. Imagine the grand festivals held in his honor, Peruli in spring, when the earth itself seemed to awaken, Nunteriashas in autumn, and the Kilam festival, where dozens of idols, each carved with exquisite detail, were paraded through streets filled with smoke, incense, and the rhythmic beat of drums. Priests and citizens alike would offer prayers, sacrifices, and elaborate dances, their voices blending into a single, almost hypnotic murmur that resonated across the stone streets and temple courtyards. Hittite religion was a mosaic of influences, Hurrian, Mesopotamian, even traces of Canaanite beliefs, yet it remained uniquely their own, a reflection of a society balancing martial ambition with spiritual devotion. Some researchers believe that their intricate mythology, filled with tales of conflict, alliances, and cosmic battles, was as much a political tool as a spiritual one, legitimizing the king's authority and integrating conquered peoples by absorbing their gods into the Hittite pantheon. The conflict with Illuyanka, the serpent, is one such tale, symbolizing the eternal struggle between chaos and order, life and destruction. In every temple, in every carved relief and statuette, from the imposing lion gate to the delicate stag emblem of a male god, the Hittites left traces of their worldview, fragments of a society deeply aware of its place in a universe both magnificent and perilous. And yet, for all their devotion and reverence, no festival, no prayer, no offering could ultimately shield them from the invisible forces epidemic, famine, or invading armies that would descend upon their cities, leaving only ruins, ash, and the faint echo of prayers carried away by the wind. One cannot help but wonder how much of their fate was sealed by human conflict, and how much by the unpredictable hand of the gods they so worshipped. Imagine stepping into the grand halls of Hattusa, the air thick with incense and murmurs of advisors, scribes, and citizens awaiting the judgment of their king. The Hittites, despite their fearsome reputation as warriors, were also meticulous lawmakers, a civilization where justice was codified, debated, and enforced under the watchful eye of both human and divine authority. Central to this system was the Pancus, a general assembly that functioned as both a high court and advisory council, a place where even kings were not beyond scrutiny. Established under King Telepinu around 1500 BC, the Pancus represented an early form of constitutional monarchy, a mechanism designed to regulate royal succession, curb lawlessness, and maintain order in a kingdom often stretched thin by war, plague, and rebellion. Members of the Pancus, drawn from the elite and the royal family, debated disputes, judged crimes, and ensured that the king's decrees aligned with established custom and law. Their edicts were recorded on clay tablets, painstakingly inscribed in cuneiform, each stroke preserving the weight of authority for generations. Unlike many contemporary civilizations, the Hittites favored restitution over retaliation. Murder, theft, and property damage were often resolved through compensation, with fines scaled to social status. Free men, naturally, received greater restitution than women or slaves, whose rights were limited, a reflection of the rigid hierarchies that underpinned the society. Yet within these rules was a subtle pragmatism. Punishments evolved over time, moving away from capital retribution and towards more humane measures. Fines replacing torture, restitution replacing death. Some researchers suggest these reforms were less about mercy and more about stability in empire recovering from epidemics. Invasions and internal strife could ill afford the chaos of widespread executions. The Pankas also had an advisory role, guiding kings on matters of succession, diplomacy, and domestic policy, ensuring continuity and limiting abrupt upheaval. Imagine the debates echoing through stone chambers, the tension between tradition and reform, the pressure on rulers to respect custom while navigating the turbulent politics of a vast empire. These laws and councils, often overlooked, were the invisible scaffolding that held the Hittite Empire together, even as armies clashed and foreign powers encroached. And yet, one wonders, could the wisdom of the Pankas, the careful balancing of justice and order, truly shield a civilization from the storms both literal and metaphorical that were gathering on the horizon? Step into the shadowed temples of Hattusa, where the flickering light of oil lamps dances across carved stone, and the scent of burning incense hangs thick in the air. The Hittites, though fierce conquerors, were deeply devout, their world governed by a pantheon of gods whose influence seeped into every aspect of life, from the battlefield to the courtroom. Central among these deities was Tarhunt, the storm god, a figure of immense power whose presence was invoked in rituals meant to secure victory, fertility, and divine favor. Some scholars suggest that Tarhunt, known in Hurrian culture as Tashab, represented not just natural forces but the very legitimacy of kingship itself, a celestial witness to the deeds of mortals. Festivals punctuated the Hittite calendar. The Perulian spring celebrated the renewal of life and the triumph over chaos, while the autumn Nuntari Ashes festival honored the harvest and the gods' continued protection. During the Kelam festival, dozens of idols paraded through the streets of Hattusa, each carved with meticulous precision, their eyes seemingly alive, their presence a constant reminder of the divine order. Hittite temples were not merely places of worship, they were centers of economic, political, and social activity, controlling land, labor, and wealth. Priests served as both spiritual intermediaries and administrators, interpreting the will of the gods, conducting sacrifices, and advising kings on matters of state. Some researchers believe that Hittite religious practices absorbed elements from Hittite, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian traditions, blending them into a uniquely Anatolian cosmology. Gods were often transformed to reflect the needs of the state. Local deities were assimilated, their identities reshaped to align with Hittite authority, ensuring that new territories accepted both divine and royal rule. The myths themselves, particularly tales of the storm gods' battles with serpents and chaotic forces, may have served as allegories for human struggles, the taming of nature, the conquest of enemies, and the maintenance of cosmic balance. But beyond ritual and ceremony lay a deeper mystery. How much of Hittite religion was truly faith, and how much was political strategy? When Suppiluliuma I marched his armies across the Levant, did the priests accompany him to bless the conquest, or to remind soldiers that the gods themselves demanded obedience? And as the empire began to weaken under disease, invasion, and internal strife, one must wonder whether the gods remained benevolent, or if their silence foretold the coming collapse. In the shadow of Hattusa's temples, amid the chants and offerings, the Hittites navigated a delicate balance between human ambition and divine will, a balance that, when tipped, may have signaled the twilight of their civilization. Asterisk. Imagine the sound of clay tablets being etched by reeds, the faint scratches forming laws meant to govern not just cities, but the very lives of the Hittite people, a civilization perched between chaos and empire. Hittite law, recorded meticulously in cuneiform, reveals a society deeply concerned with order, yet strangely pragmatic in its approach to justice. Unlike other ancient kingdoms, where death could be the default punishment for theft or assault, the Hittites often favored restitution, a measured compensation that restored balance without unnecessary bloodshed. Some researchers suggest that these laws evolved from religious principles as much as practical necessity. The king was not merely a ruler, but the earthly executor of divine will, tasked with maintaining harmony between mortals and gods. The Pancus, a council established during the Old Kingdom, acted as a proto-constitutional body, reviewing cases even against the king himself, ensuring that power had limits and that the concept of justice extended beyond personal whim. Yet, there was still inequality embedded in these codes. Men often received higher compensation than women, and slaves had minimal rights, their fates largely dependent on their master's mercy. Despite these disparities, the Hittites' legal system displayed a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, marriage, inheritance, and property rights, attempting to codify human behavior in ways that balanced punishment with societal stability. By the 16th and 15th centuries BC, the laws underwent reforms, shifting away from corporal and capital punishment toward fines and restitution, a move some historians interpret as an early form of humanitarian legal evolution. The Hittite law codes also reveal an almost microscopic attention to detail: what to do if an animal was killed, how to resolve disputes between neighbors, the consequences of broken engagements, and even the treatment of slaves, children. Religious transgressions, however, remained severe, often punished by death or public ritual humiliation, reflecting the inseparable bond between faith and law. One can almost hear the quiet deliberations in the king's court, the low murmur of advisors weighing fines, the scratching of styluses as scribes recorded verdicts. All while outside, the city of Hattusa hummed with life, trade, and the constant threat of war. And yet, beneath this veneer of order, a tension persisted. Laws designed to maintain stability could only go so far when disease, invasion, and internal rebellion pressed upon the empire. How much of the Hittites' downfall could be traced not to their enemies, but to the fragile human structures they had built, structures that relied on obedience, honor, and the ever-present shadow of divine oversight. As we move forward, we will see how this delicate balance between law, religion, and royal authority would be tested by forces far beyond Hattusa's walls, heralding challenges that the Hittites might never have anticipated. Asterisk. Close your eyes and imagine the roar of thunder echoing across the Anatolian plains, the sky darkened by storm clouds, and at the heart of it, the Hittite king invoking Tahont, the storm god, in a ritual as old as the hills themselves. Religion in the Hittite Empire was not a passive faith. It was the lifeblood of the state, a force intertwined with politics, warfare, and daily life. Tahont, also known as Teshub in Hurrian traditions, was more than a deity. He was the conqueror, the judge, the embodiment of power and order. He was depicted as a bearded man riding twin mountains, wielding a club, his symbol the mighty bull, a creature both revered and feared. The Hittites' pantheon was vast and complex, absorbing gods from the Hassi, Hurrians, Mesopotamians, and even distant Canaanites, reflecting the empire's reach and the fluidity of belief in a world of constant expansion and conquest. Festivals such as Peruli in spring, Nun Teriashas in autumn, and Ki, Lam in the ceremonial gatehouses were not merely religious observances, but demonstrations of state power, parading idols through the streets, reaffirming the king's divine mandate and the god's protection over the land. Some researchers believe these public rituals also served to unite a culturally diverse population, integrating local deities into a larger imperial framework to avoid dissent and maintain cohesion. Hittite temples and sanctuaries were more than architectural marvels. They were centers of economic and social activity, storing wealth, hosting scribes, and serving as repositories for legal and religious knowledge. Yet, religion was not only about order and ceremony, it was a lens through which the Hittites interpreted the unpredictable world around them. Storms, plagues, and invasions were often seen as expressions of divine displeasure, prompting ritual, sacrifice, and sometimes desperate measures. The intertwined nature of faith and law meant that disobedience was both a political and spiritual threat, punishable not only by fines or restitution, but by rituals meant to cleanse the transgression. The empire's eventual decline raises questions about the limits of divine authority. Could gods protect a civilization when famine, disease, and foreign powers bore down simultaneously? Were the rituals, the prayers, the festivals enough to stave off the encroaching shadows of history? As we leave the sacred halls and step into the streets of Hattusa, we begin to glimpse how belief shaped the Hittite mind, influencing not only the choices of kings and generals, but the very survival of a civilization that would, centuries later, vanish almost overnight, leaving only whispers of gods, laws, and storms etched into clay and stone. Sit back and imagine a bustling Hittite city, the sound of hooves clattering on stone streets, merchants calling out from market stalls and within the royal palace, scribes painstakingly pressing wedge-shaped cuneiform into clay tablets, recording the laws that governed life across the empire. Hittite law was not a mere reflection of authority. It was a carefully structured system designed to maintain order, balance power, and protect property, all while intertwining secular justice with divine oversight. The earliest codes, dating back to the Old Kingdom, contained strict punishments, including death and torture, for severe crimes such as murder or offenses against religion, while theft, assault, and property damage often required restitution or fines. Interestingly, the Hittites were among the first civilizations to move away from the idea that punishment should always be violent, introducing reforms that favored monetary compensation over corporal or capital punishment, a remarkable shift in an era dominated by brutal justice. These reforms, some scholars suggest, may have been inspired by pragmatic concerns to many deaths, weakened the workforce, and disrupted agriculture, or by evolving notions of fairness and governance. The Pankas, a council of elders and nobles, served as a high court for constitutional crimes, a rare example of legal oversight where even kings were not entirely above the law, their actions subject to review and deliberation. Laws were gendered and hierarchical. Free men often received higher compensation than women for the same offense, while slaves had limited rights and could be punished at the whim of their masters. Yet within these rules, there was a sense of order and predictability, a social contract that defined acceptable behavior and ensured continuity across a sprawling empire. Marriage, inheritance, and the treatment of slaves were all codified, reflecting a society deeply invested in family, property, and loyalty. Some articles even reveal an early understanding of liability and intent. For example, if an animal was claimed to have died by the hand of a god, the owner could not demand compensation, suggesting an attempt to navigate the unpredictable forces of life and nature. As we examine these tablets, we glimpse a civilization striving to create fairness, to regulate human behavior not only through fear but through reasoned structure. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, could such meticulous law withstand the chaos of disease, war, and invasion that would soon engulf the empire? Were these reforms enough to preserve an empire that would eventually crumble, leaving only clay and stone as testament to its ambitions and its order? Close your eyes and picture the temples of Hattusa, sun glinting off bronze statues, the scent of incense thick in the air, and priests chanting in a language older than the empire itself. Hittite religion was a tapestry woven from the threads of Hattic, Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and Canaanite traditions, layered over a distinctly Indo-European core that still echoes faintly in their myths. Central to this pantheon was Tahund, the storm god, known to the Hurrians as Sheb, a figure of immense power, his very presence commanding respect and fear. Some sources describe him as a bearded man straddling twin mountains, wielding a club, his eyes flashing lightning across the horizon, a god of battle, victory, and divine justice. Teshub's legendary conflict with the serpent Iluyanka was more than myth. It symbolized the eternal struggle between order and chaos, a story repeated in carvings, reliefs, and ritual dramas throughout Hittite cities. Festivals were not mere pageantry, but complex rituals blending devotion, politics, and social cohesion. Perulian spring celebrated renewal and triumph over chaos, while the Nontariasha's festival in autumn marked agricultural cycles and divine oversight of harvests. The Kilam festival, with images of the storm god and up to 30 other deities paraded through streets, transformed civic space into a living shrine, reminding citizens that divine power was omnipresent, overseeing every act of trade, war, and domestic life. Some researchers believe that these elaborate ceremonies reinforced the king's superhuman aura, making him not just a political leader, but a living representative of the gods on earth. Others suggest that the gods themselves were flexible, absorbing local deities into the Hittite pantheon to legitimize expansion and maintain order in newly conquered territories. Stone reliefs, bronze statuettes, and temple carvings provide glimpses of this complex spiritual world. Yet their worn surfaces hint at centuries of devotion now lost to time. Even everyday Hittite life was suffused with religious consciousness. A farmer's offering to a local deity, a soldier's prayer before battle, and the king's ceremonial tour of holy cities were all threads in a network of belief that bound the empire together. And yet, despite this intricate system of divine oversight and ritual, the Hittites could not escape the vulnerabilities of human existence. Famine, war, and the relentless pressure of external threats. How could a civilization so entwined with its gods vanish so suddenly, leaving behind only fragments of stone, clay, and whispered stories of storms and serpents. The mysteries of their faith linger, echoing through the empty streets of Hattusa, as if the gods themselves keep their secrets hidden, waiting for us to piece together the riddles of a vanished empire. Imagine walking through the ruins of Hattusa, the air heavy with dust, the faint echoes of footsteps long gone, and before you rise colossal gates, carved lions frozen in eternal vigilance, their eyes staring blankly across centuries. Hittite art, though scarce in surviving form, speaks volumes about a civilization obsessed with power, ritual, and permanence. At Alaka Hyuk, the Sphinx gates guard a city once teeming with life. Bronze standards glint in muted light, and intricate carvings of stags, lions, and other sacred animals hint at beliefs that intertwined the natural and the divine. Metalwork, such as the Alaka Hyuk bronze standards, is precise yet expressive, each detail telling a story of ritual, status, and craftsmanship that rivaled contemporary Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions. Carved ivories and ceramics, including the Husi-Indid verses, offer glimpses into daily life, ceremonial practices, and the aesthetic values of a people whose empire stretched across Anatolia and into Syria. Some scholars suggest that the grand scale of these works was designed to impress both citizens and foreign visitors, reinforcing the king's authority as a representative of divine power. Others propose that Hittite monuments served more subtle purposes, such as channeling spiritual energy, marking sacred landscapes, or communicating coded messages about lineage and legitimacy to rival powers. Ataflatun P. Na, a spring monument carved directly into the limestone. Water flows as it did thousands of years ago, surrounded by stone reliefs whose meanings remain partially obscured, a silent testament to a ritualistic culture that understood the power of place. Even large recumbent lions, like those found at Hattusa and possibly Babylon, were not mere decorations, symbols of dominance, and warnings to intruders that this land was under divine protection. Rock reliefs such as Hanyeri and Hemite further attest to a culture deeply concerned with asserting presence, legacy, and authority, carved into cliffs where only the observant or the daring could glimpse them. Yet, despite their grandeur, nearly all Hittite artworks bear the marks of time, erosion, weathering, and the occasional deliberate defacement, reminders that even the most imposing creations are vulnerable. In the midst of these stones, one can almost hear the whispers of artisans, priests, and citizens, echoes of a civilization that sought to make the ephemeral eternal. And as we stand among these remnants, we are left with a haunting question. How could a people capable of such monumental vision vanish almost overnight, leaving only the silent testimony of their art to answer the mysteries of their vanished world? Step into the shadowed temples and open-air sanctuaries of the Hittites, where the air was thick with incense, the cries of birds mingling with the murmured prayers of priests, and the sun glinting off bronze statuettes that captured the essence of gods who walked invisibly among mortals. Hittite religion was a tapestry woven from the threads of Hattic, Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and Canaanite traditions, yet distinctly their own, creating a pantheon as complex as the empire itself. At the apex stood Tarhunt, or Teshub, in Hurrian texts, the storm god whose very name evoked thunder and rain, whose symbol, the bull, was worshipped not merely as an animal but as an embodiment of power, fertility, and divine wrath. Some researchers believe Tarhunt's presence was both protective and terrifying, embodying the forces that could nurture crops or flattened fields with a storm. Festivals, such as Peruli in spring, the Nuntariashas festival in autumn, and the Kilam festival transformed cities into a living stage, parading images of the storm god alongside 30 or more other deities, their rituals designed to harmonize human and divine intentions, to remind citizens of the fragile boundary between order and chaos. Lesser gods, spirits, and divine patrons oversaw every facet of life: war, agriculture, childbirth, and even justice, creating a world where every misfortune could be interpreted as the will of unseen forces. Hittite mythology, preserved in clay tablets, reveals epic struggles like the battle between Teshub and the serpent Yanka, symbolic of cosmic conflicts played out in human affairs. Scholars debate whether these stories were literal, allegorical, or ritualistic, yet all agree that they shaped the worldview of kings and commoners alike, legitimizing royal authority and guiding societal norms. Temples were centers of economic and political activity as well, controlling land, labor, and tribute, with priests wielding influence that rivaled that of military commanders. Some suggest that Hittite kings themselves functioned as high priests, performing ceremonies to maintain divine favor and social stability, traveling across holy cities in a ritual circuit designed to integrate newly conquered regions. Others note the subtle imposition of Hittite interpretations onto local deities, a method of political as well as spiritual assimilation. As we stand before these vanished altars and ritual sites, we are left to wonder, how deeply did fear, reverence, and ambition intertwine in the daily lives of the Hittites? And could such a delicate balance of power and piety survive the storms that would eventually sweep their empire into oblivion? As the last embers of Hattusa's fires dimmed against the horizon, the Hittite Empire slipped silently into the shadows of history. Its fall so sudden, it seemed as though an entire civilization had been erased in a single breath. Picture it: the fortress walls crumbling under the weight of flames, the once bustling streets emptied of voices, and marketplaces that had once shimmered with bronze, silver, and song now hushed in eternal stillness. Scholars have long wrestled with the mystery of its collapse. Some point to the sea peoples, marauders who swept across the Mediterranean like a storm, while others cite the Kaskians and migrating Phrygians pressing in from the north. Yet environmental records tell another story: 3 consecutive years of devastating drought between 1198 and 1196 BC. When rains failed, rivers shrank to trickles, and fields turned to dust. Perhaps it was not one cause, but many: rebellion festering in distant provinces, famine hollowing out the heart of the empire, plagues like tularemia gnawing at its people, and armies stretched too thin to defend what once seemed eternal. Still, the Hittites did not vanish entirely. Their spirit fractured but endured in the Syro-Hittite state Skarkamish, Malid, and others that carried echoes of their language, laws, and gods long after Hattusa's fall. Their cuneiform tablets and Luwian hieroglyphs continued to record treaties and prayers, whispering through the ages to civilizations that would rise upon their ruins. Some historians suggest that Hittite law, with its surprising mercy, favoring restitution over revenge, left subtle fingerprints on the justice systems that came after, a legacy of order in a world descending into chaos. Their gods, too, refused to die, their myths woven into the faiths of later cultures. Their lions still guard silent gates, and the sacred carvings at Eflet and Penor still murmur of forgotten rites. Yet what truly haunts the memory of the Hittites is not what remains, but what was lost, the speed of their disappearance, the way an empire of such sophistication could collapse almost overnight. As we trace their story through broken tablets and weathered stones, we are reminded of how thin the line is between endurance and oblivion, what truly causes a civilization to fall. And if the Hittites could disappear so completely, what does that say about us, standing centuries later, surrounded by the same uncertainties, the same fragile illusions of permanence?